Welcome to Running on Ice, the coolest community in freight. I'm your host, Mary O'Connell, bringing you the latest tech updates, warehouse news, and everything happening in the cold chain world. Not only is there the coolest show in freight, but there's also Running on Ice, the newsletter that could not be colder. You can subscribe to that on freightwaves.com/runningonIce. Today, we welcome back Karl McDermott, General Manager, UBQ Network, and Chief Saas Officer at DeltaTrak. Welcome back to the show, Karl.
Good morning, Mary. It's a pleasure to be back on the show.
I'm excited to get into it today. We've recently kind of had our preparing for produce season, preparing for the 100 days of summer. And we've kind of been like, here's some possible disruptions in the market, but now we're just going to kind of, for lack of a better word, we're going to marry them together. So before we get too far though, can you kind of briefly explain what specialty crops are and why they're kind of so critical to the cold chain?
Yeah, sure. So specialty crops are basically anything that's fruit and vegetables, dried nuts, anything that's, horticulture or floriculture. And they're known as specialty crops just because they're different from commodity crops. And the commodity crops are the corn, it's the wheat, it's the grains that, typically fall under that category. So basically, layman's terms, it's like everything in fresh produce.
So it's most of what you would see at your grocery store. Like when you get strawberries in the winter time, that's a specialty. Actually, strawberries any time of the year would be a specialty crop. I got to say, I don't find much soybeans or like feed corn at my grocery store. I got to say, it's a little lacking in that selection.
Yeah. And so it's again, for the simple definition, it's everything you'll find in the grocery store, in the aisles, in the fresh or, some of those dry sections. So, all your fruit and veg comes onto that particular banner.
It's nice that our fruit and veg is considered special because it's special to me.
Yeah, and we are what we eat. So in many cases, if we want to feel special, we have to eat specialty produce.
I like that. If you want to feel special, you got to eat your specialty produce. When it comes to the impact of the specialty crops and our fruits and veggies and everything like that, why is there such a large cross-border demand for it? Because it's not like a negligible amount that like we trade, especially between the US and Mexico.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'll go back to your strawberries because, when I was a young lad, I'm going back quite a while now, we have this tennis tournament called Wimbledon, and strawberries would peak around that time. It would be end of June, beginning of July in the UK, and that's when they were the most fresh. But you'd have that short window of maybe 4 weeks of strawberries. Now, the last 30 years has given us, I would say, seasonal produce and vegetables all the year round. And what that's done is create these, supply chains where as a consumer, now we expect to find strawberries all year round. So if they weren't grown in the US, they could be grown in Mexico and then obviously shipped on a truck to satisfy those consumers. That's really what's been happening over the last 30 years or 35 years in the produce and grocery business. Give not seasonal produce, and provide availability all year round.
I think that personally, as a consumer, I am not mad about this because I remember growing up, you had usually apples and oranges were always like around. But I remember like this summer was always berries and like we would go strawberry picking and like there was a whole thing and like you just didn't get strawberries in December. Like you just didn't. You'd have to wait for the summer to come around. And now selfishly, I love that I can get strawberries year round. I mean, sometimes they're not as good as like the middle of June, but they're still there.
Yeah. So what you've seen then basically is that this flow of, seasonal produce going from farms, sometimes it's cross country. So again, you mentioned oranges, Florida producing, all year round to different parts of the US, but strawberries, there are specific, if you like, growing needs. So again, Mexico might be supplying some of those strawberries in the, the non-season of US production. And that's created these huge, cross-border flows of produce, not just from Mexico to the US, but also Canada to the US, but also, the US exports a lot of their grains and a lot of their protein back to Mexico and Canada. So it's, up until fairly recently, a happy scenario where everyone's focused on what they're good at and doing best. And it's been flipped over a little bit, right? It's been a bit of a roller coaster the last 45 days, I think would be probably the right term.
Yeah, it's been an experience. Who doesn't love global trade just being global? But jumping into that, so we've seen a lot of changes, with just all across not the country, the world, of different import export requirements and different things like that. So what other changes, or what are some of those more recent impactful changes that we've seen that has really kind of hindered some of the flow of those goods?
Yeah. So I think the first thing we should really consider, Mary, is first, what was the value of this trade? So I think $1.3 trillion is the typical USMCA regional commerce. Break it down to produce, and roughly 50% of produce imported to the US. I think it's slightly higher in vegetables, slightly lower in fruit. So 63% veg, 47% fruit comes from outside the country. In this case, Mexico is one of those biggest providers. So what we've seen with the tariffs, or at least I'll walk that back with this, if you like, roller coaster of tariffs announcements, is that people or organizations were getting into back into their risk management scenarios. They're putting their risk management hats back. And I think you have to break that down from sourcing, where do I get my produce from? And then the supply chain, which is how do I move it from that farm or that particular packing facility or cooling facility to my DCs and then stores and consumers. And all of that network that we've been building over the last 35 years was basically put out there to say, okay, if there are going to be tariffs of 25% from Mexican produce to the US, what if then if we started sourcing from Colombia? So that was where we were maybe a bit longer, 30 days ago. Now, obviously, the US administration hasn't put any tariffs on the specialty crops that we were talking about earlier, which, again, for you and me is stuff that we get in our supermarket, fruit and veg, which means all of that scenario planning was not done and was wasteful. But there has not been changes so far from the tariff perspective. Now, there are some knock-on effects that I'll cover off later, which have happened. So if you're exporting, let's say, from Canada, and you were looking for avocados or looking for tomatoes, so it's not just the US consumers, Canadian consumers, you were typically buying from a marketing organization on the US side of the border. Again, no tariffs, so it made a lot of sense. It's consolidated in a couple of places, McAllen in Texas, Nogales in Arizona, and that's where Canadian supermarkets were buying. Now they're actually planning to maybe buy directly from the farm. There's going to be an in-bond, if you like. In-bond basically means a transit shipment where you're not paying taxes for that particular shipment of avocados coming in, but you're doing additional filing, right? And there's going to be additional inspection. So there are, even though there's no, additional tariffs right now on the specialty crops, it is creating a lot of disruption in the sourcing and supply chains. And again, I think we can delve into that, a little bit of some of the implications.
And it's something that you don't really think about until you're like, okay, well, I know, for example, a lot of Mexican farmers have altered their planting cycles to be in line with what the rest of the North American consumers need. And so I know a lot of it has gone by what US consumers have wanted at their grocery stores. So that's why they have a whole season dedicated to, I know avocados aren't necessarily always a winter fruit, but a lot of Mexican farmers have made it where there's a bunch of avocados that are ready for Super Bowl Sunday, for example, because that's a huge day for people, and that's like one of the top avocado consumption days in the US, and I'm just like, this is a really weird stat, but it makes sense because if all those people need it, that demand has to be there.
Yeah, yeah, totally agree. And you see those peak demand days. So not just in the US, the China has the New Year coming in. So there's a massive flow of cherries going into China to make it for China Lunar New Year, and you'll see those events. I mean, anything around specific anniversaries, Mother's Days, special celebrations, bank holidays. There is a lot of effort done on planning to make sure the produce is there to support the consumer demand at a specific point. And again, some of that's been thrown out of kilter, if you like, with these tariff scenarios that people are building in now.
Yeah, because it's kind of almost because I like to think that specifically in cold chain, we had the pandemic and that was a really, really put people through the ringers. But then we're almost kind of having a similar, it's kind of like a test, like a stress test of how well did you build this supply chain? How good are your contingency plans? But it also needs to happen quickly because a lot of these things are changing like within a few days of being announced or being rolled back or whatever. It's really come down to like how flexible can you be.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I think obviously maybe it's not the produce industry that's directly at cause or impacted even. So if you're looking at tariffs coming from other countries, a lot of that ends up on containers coming to US ports. Now, the CBP, I think they operate 300 plus 328 port entries, including airports, land entries like Mexico, Canada, and maritime ports. And now they're going to have to send more resources to the maritime side because, there's more inspections coming in. There's additional paperwork required. There's additional filing on the automated commercial environment, which is run by CBP, to basically do your customs clearance. So all of that's going to create, I would say, more conflict at the border or more delays at the border. That's the principal kind of issue. And there's going to be some knock-on effects then. If produce gets stacked up, there's going to be some additional days that it's not being processed because you don't prioritize a truck or a container containing produce, compared to some other kind of, goods, dry goods, clothes, whatever else is being imported. So there's going to be those knock-on effects, and that will affect, we think, freshness and shelf life ultimately. So, yeah, no tariffs right now, but the impact is delays at ports, a reduction of freshness, and that's something we're going to start to see slowly, I think, in the US grocery marketplace.
So because right now there's I I don't want to call it a rumor because it's kind of a real thing, but also it's not like officially real. And that is, I think in the next month, there's supposed to be a tariff on just tomatoes that are happening, which is fantastic, but not really. It's just a bigger pain because, like you said, it's going to create those additional delays for inspections, and it's going to overall affect not just the quality of tomatoes, but all the other produce because it's all getting stuck and held up. Um, so you mentioned the shortened shelf life and the decreased qualities. What other kind of like indirect things are happening as a result of either tomatoes getting exempt out of this or just other problems? Like I know you talked about that spoilage. What else are we looking at?
Yeah, and tomato is an interesting case because this is really going back to a 2019 agreement, basically on pricing of tomatoes. Again, Mexico exports, I think, 95+% of their tomato production to the US. And that particular agreement was put in place to avoid dumping of tomatoes, so price dumping. And it's run by a team actually from the US Commerce Department. And it seemed to be working well. Now, I guess I'm not sure if the claim of canceling that agreement and then putting this blanket, I think it's 20+% tariff on there, is a call to action to kind of, maybe reduce the flow of tomatoes that were entering the country under a different agreement or in some other shape or form. Or maybe it's a way of bringing Mexico to the table of negotiating. But it's something very specific. I don't think it fits under that typical umbrellas of the tariffs that we've seen today. It was more of an agreement. They want to annul that agreement and look at some other kind of new implementation. I think it's way of negotiating really with the Mexican producers.
Okay. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's the specific case on tomatoes. Now, again, what we're seeing is obviously delays in impacts on freshness and shelf life, but I think we'll see some other impacts, from the tariffs, and some of those might be non-tariff, if you like, barriers to entry. So inspections typically were the tool that the U.S. government has used to kind of put pressure on importers or exporters, selling products to U.S. importers, importing and goods into the U.S. So again, if you use these non-tariff barriers, we're going to basically do an inspection on every single load. That has a similar effect to tariffs. It's going to cause delays. It's going to slow things down and obviously impact freshness. Ironically, I think what we'll see from the U.S. perspective is the tariffs. If it does create more disruption, I think organized crime is going to try and take advantage of this. So, ironically, you might see actually a bit larger flow of drugs in here because all the inspectors are actually busy looking, across, doing lots of different activities. And again, there's a finite number of inspectors, and then maybe they're not looking at the loads that organized crime, trying to, insert or push through the typical supply chain network. So again, thinking produce from flying to Mexico. And then in the same way, you might see lots of counterfeiting or maybe counterfeiting growing because companies will look at maybe changing their certificates of origin, or if they're like being creative on certificates of origin. Again, maybe it's not critical in the produce industry, but again, anything on the fashion side, anything that was produced maybe in China, if they can say there was some sub-assembly done in a third-party country that has a lower tariff, we might see a lot more counterfeit or mislabeling, if you like. And those would be, unwanted impacts of tariffs.
That's something that the kind of misrepresentation of information is something that we've talked about at length in our like a lot of the fraud conversations that there are. Because I mean, we saw it at the beginning of the year when there was an egg shortage. People, criminals stole like trailers of eggs, and I'm just like, why? Like what? And it's anytime there's that demand for something, the criminal underworld, which makes it sound like it's literally like the seedy back alleys, but the criminal enterprises will come and find that product and they'll take it. And I mean that's something that we've kind of already seen, and whether it's through true negligence or like whether it's intentional or just oops, I didn't understand what I was doing, but we've seen even like just I think they just found like a couple $1 million worth of misrepresented information or stuff that wasn't properly tariffed or wasn't properly represented, so it could be tariffed. And so I think like you said, that will continue to grow, especially as importers kind of figure out what's going on, because then they're not only are those importers going to have to pay the tariffs, they're going to have to pay the fines that come with potentially misrepresenting that information. But yeah, I'm very curious to see kind of how this evolves, because it's, if there's one thing I've learned is that if people don't want to pay it, they'll find a way not to pay it.
Yeah, and tariffs or international commerce hinges on typically two things. There's the HS code, which is the declaration of the specific category of produce or products. Is probably the better term being imported because it applies to every single product category. And then you've got your certificates of origin. And I think we're going to have to try and ensure, again, there might be a way that technology helps that becomes digitized as much as possible and people trust the documents. But as you said, every time there's a disruption, there's always an opportunity for someone to fulfill or that specific need. And you mentioned eggs, and obviously the price of eggs in the US, very quickly that was, did cause, some I would say produce entering the US under maybe some lighter weight phytosanitary rules, compared to other countries. And obviously, as you mentioned, there was some produce or products, in the egg category that were being stolen and then obviously being sold on the black market. So yeah, those are kind of unwanted and unexpected, if you like, results of tariff changes. Again, we're upending basically, the MO or the modus operandi of, how the world's been run for the last 30 years. And that's going to, that change is going to create opportunities for someone.
And it's not with change comes opportunities, whether it's good or bad, because you'll have people who take advantage of it in a good way and say, okay, we've built some tools to help. We've, figured out some common fraud schemes. Like we are taking this opportunity to grow and be better. And then you'll have those that do the others. And they're going to say, I can make a couple bucks off of this. And by a couple bucks, probably a cool couple mil, which I don't like, but also it is what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think if we put get back to really the conversation, which is, we're trying to provide consumers with the best possible produce, if you like, the best quality food all year round. And, I think there's a lot of, I would say, professional companies and professional organizations still trying to make that happen, looking at these angles for risk management. And again, we might talk about a little bit in a minute, some of the changes in the supply chain, but it does create some of these, opportunities for, food fraud or, counterfeiting or some other, black market activity, gray market that were unexpected.
So that does actually lead me into my next question for you. So we're having all of these various, like I'm a food shipper. I'm just trying to get my avocados, my strawberries, my specialty crops. I'm just trying to get those into the US or into Mexico or Canada. But we've mentioned quite a few, opportunities for risk, and that is whether it's theft or waste or spoilage or suddenly getting hit with a super huge bill I wasn't anticipating. What kind of strategies are out there for me as kind of a food shipper to really limit those opportunities, like really limit my exposure to these various risks that are kind of rapidly popping up?
Yeah. Yeah. Good question. I think, produce goes from, very basic commodities, carrots and potatoes, all the way up to high value commodities or specialty crops such as, your berries, your avocados. At the top end, a truck or a container might be worth $100K or $125,000. It doesn't compare to, iPhones, right? Which obviously, I think what Apple was doing was they airlifted in, 6 planes of iPhones to have, and basically get in front of those tariff introductions for China, right? Because their sourcing in China. In the world of produce, most of it actually moves in a truck. So anywhere it can, which will be continental, North America, Mexico, US, Canada, Europe, it's mostly moved on a truck. Anything international that doesn't cross one of those land entries, usually going on a container in a reefer, they're called, or a reefer unit. We don't see a lot of changes there. I mean, there's not a lot of opportunity to put, avocados on an airplane, right? It just, doesn't make sense. In fact, the just because it's, medium value and, there is a time sensitive angle doesn't mean that, air freight's the answer. So let me just talk about what we're seeing in the supply chain. So, it's still going to be trucks, it's still going to be some containers. The rail network might have a little bit more to play because there might be, some additional capacity there to take on more volume that we don't have in trucks and containers. That's one. In the warehousing side, what we're seeing is maybe the growth of inbound. So again, in those places like McAllen, those crossing points, companies are maybe hoarding product in warehouses, thinking, well, let's see what happens. Again, specialty crops, you can't keep hoarding produce forever because there's obviously a time that it's going to deteriorate and go bad, right? So, it has to be moved fairly effortlessly through the supply chain. I do think maybe we're going to see a little bit of, again, fragility, most of trucks were actually full truckloads. So I think what we'll see maybe is the growth of less than truck loads, LTL, specifically because people want more agility to doing maybe the outbound, the DCs to stores, and maybe mixing up, what produce is being on there, maybe what's the right term? Compartmentalizing, making separate compartments. Maybe we'll have to go and edit that.
Compartmentalizing.
Compartmentalizing, parts of the truck, maybe with different temperatures. So that's what we really think is going to happen. So mostly going on a truck, mostly going on containers if it's international, and then I think some additional warehousing to absorb some of this capacity, but that's limited because of the freshness side, and then maybe a move towards more LTL.
I think it's, LTL always comes through. It's always there for you. It's always there. It's whenever things get a little sideways, LTL gets real popular.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think the cold chain for LTL has been typical because even if you put 3 different commodities in a truck, so you may be shipping some dry, which would be potatoes, and then some sensitive, which could be avocados, and then each of them have probably an ideal temperature that's mandated by the USDA. So, that's why we haven't had a lot of LTL in produce. But I think now maybe some of the technology, some of that, the compartments that you can put inside a truck and the traceability of that is improving. So, that LTL is maybe slightly more expensive, but it's a little bit more flexible. I think what people are looking for is agility. What companies are looking for is, okay, let's keep operating the supply chain, but let's build in more agility to respond to whatever's coming down the line, right, in terms of changes, because it is a bit up and down.
I think anything that you can do to kind of build in some security is going to be paramount, or just to build in something that gives you a little bit more control over a situation where you might not have complete control.
Yeah. And so I think that applies, you're sourcing. So you might start sourcing from different farms, different organizations that previously hadn't done business. You might start working, with new trade lanes. And obviously the trade lanes requires, I would say, trusted, if you like, carriers and 3PLs to work with you. So, there's probably going to be a lot of work on all of those aspects to kind of de-risk parts of that sourcing and supply.
I want to say I'm excited to see what the rest of the year has in store for the cold chain, but we'll see.
Yeah. And I certainly, we're coming up to the summer months. So, the challenges usually in the summer is more to do with keeping the cold chain working. It's the additional heat load in many parts of the country. So has its own unique challenges, right? Which, if we add that to the mix of all this change, then, I think the supply chain professionals and logistics teams, and also the fresh produce teams are going to have a bit busy time ahead of them. And again, hopefully technology will help, bring down that workload. And so they just focus on the critical things, and, they're not trying to juggle too many tasks at once.
Speaking of critical things, Karl, we are coming toward the end of our time today, and it is incredibly critical for your answer for this next question. And that is going to be, if you could build a house out of any food, what would it be?
Great question. So you touched on this right at the beginning of the podcast. So when I started thinking about this, well, whatever produce we use has to be sustainable, has to have some kind of structural. We're talking about a house, right? So it has to have some kind of structure, has to be available. So I chose sweet corn. And I know you didn't like the corn, but I thought a sweet corn would make a good building block. And sometimes, back in the times, we had these adobe built houses, again, in parts of Mexico, and probably New Mexico have used this. And I think the sweet corn can be the adobe of building with produce or specialty crops. You just have to be wary of the mold, I think.
I like where your head's at. I would not want to be in a corn house in the rainstorm, because that would be, like you said, that mold's going to be a real problem.
Yeah. I guess it's only going to work for certain geographies, but there you go. That was my answer. I hope.
I absolutely love that. What a great answer. What a great answer. Well, if anyone has any tips on a house built out of corn, or if they are just like so overwhelmed by anything in the cold chain and they just need some help and they just want to bounce some ideas off you, where can they find you outside the show?
Yep. I think there's two places to look for me. So K McDermott at deltatruck.com, McDermott with a double T at the end, or look for me on LinkedIn and any of our social media accounts, DeltaTrak or ubq.network. But yeah, those are the best places to have conversations with me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Mary, for your time and for your thought-provoking questions. It's always a pleasure to chat to you.
Thank you. You can catch other episodes of Running on Ice right here on FreightWaves TV, YouTube, or anywhere else you get your podcasts like Apple Podcast and Spotify. Need more Running on Ice news? No sweat. Subscribe to the newsletter on freightwaves.com/runningonIce. See you on the internet.